Hi, again the same position. Today we are going to check you can call it accelerated Sveshnikov variation, move e5. Immediately here, just to remind you that the main Sveshnikov is knight f6, knight c3, e5. Advantages and disadvantages of the move e5. The main advantage for black is that there is far less theory after e5, so it's easier to study it and to play. I mean, you don't have to memorize quite a number of forced and non-forced variations. The disadvantage is that objectively Sveshnikov is a bit sounder than this force e5. That's also actually quite logical if you think about it. I mean, there is always I know by myself, there is always a temptation to study something which is good for black, which is very sound, and there is not so much theory. But the problem is that something which is sound is played by many people, so the theory develops much more in those lines. And that is a problem if you want, so it's very difficult to manage both. That's why, unfortunately, if you want to play the most sound variations also of Sicilian, let's say, are those which are the most theoretical, the most amount of games and opening variations to study. That's why it's the same situation here. So e5 is playable, definitely playable line, but I think white keeps certain plus here, and or black can still go into the Sveshnikov in a couple of lines, as you will see now, but then it's maybe more logical to start with the classical Sveshnikov move order, knight f6 and e5. Anyways, let's check this force e5. Knight b5 is definitely the best move because as we will see in the Sveshnikov variation, it's the same story, knight b5. Of course, now, d6 is the main move. Knight f6 doesn't make, any sense because white at least can play knight c3. Then I think starting with knight f6 is more forcing because here white also has quite dangerous move bishop g5. So no point to play with this move order. But a6 is a possible move. Actually, it's you need to know some theory with white here. I mean, definitely it's not fun for black if white knows what he's doing. But otherwise, if white check has to be played, takes. If white is not very well prepared or maybe not prepared at all against this variation, there is a fair chance that black can equalize here. Now queen f6 is the best move in this position. Well, queen e7 with the same idea is it's quite sad actually, because white just comes back to d1 and then it comes to this position d6 and the white simply plays bishop g5. Not quite clear why black has given white two bishops. After bishop e6 is simplest because black wants to play h6 and maybe get a decent position. But the simplest is knight d5 now, takes, black's knight has to retreat and white is playing bishop e2, and with two bishops is typical knight structure, but two bishops against two knights, definitely white has an advantage here. So the whole idea of this variation is to play queen f6. And now actually white has quite a wide choice of moves. The most direct, the most forcing and the main line for me in this lesson would be queen d1, but there are other moves also. Actually, queen c7 is quite interesting move. Of course, a little bit scary, you might be afraid that the queen will get lost, but not. It's not getting lost. I mean, you cannot trap this queen so easily. So knight e7, knight c3. From the other point of view, the queen on c7 is quite bothering black, black's position. So he has to play knight b4, pretty direct line actually, a theoretical line, bishop d3, d5. Otherwise, white is just better. Here also, after castles, black is playing d4, knight a4. Knight wants to get to b6, and that would be quite painful. So then queen c6 is played. using the fact that if queen takes e5, then the knight on a4 is hanging. Takes, practically forced. Knight b6, rook b8, and this endgame is somewhat better for white. I mean, it's not totally clear if black can manage finally to equalize, let's say f4, f6, but not too much for white. I mean, the knight on b6 is pretty good there. White is usually playing bishop d2 or something. Sooner or later, black will take on d3. In this position, white has a bit of a plus, but probably not enough really to win the game. Anyway, it's, I would say, unpleasant enough because black has nothing better than this variation after queen c7, and he has to defend a slightly inferior endgame. Queen takes f6 leads to a similar scenario, but actually here black is closer to equality, practically equalizing, I would say. Takes, knight c3, knight b4, and now, well, bishop d3 gives white a very, very minimal plus, but of course it should be nothing really. So king d2 is more principal, at least trying to keep two bishops. d6, b3, trying to go bishop a3, for example. Maybe black can play like this. Well, maybe white is a little bit better, but yeah, I'm not too impressed. Should be close to equality. So those moves are not principal, very safe for white, but not very principal. Actually, quite an interesting move is queen d2. Also gives white some chances for opening advantage, but anyway, I think queen d1 is good enough. Actually good enough for white, for you if you're playing this variation with white, and bad enough for black to think twice about playing this variation, because now, again, play gets pretty direct. Queen g6, knight c3. Well, white has two bishops, and let's say in case of knight f6, queen d6 back is very powerful move. White is just much better. So, I mean, after knight e7, white is probably better in many ways, maybe even h4. I mean, white can play h4, for example, trying to kick this queen with h5. So basically, the whole, I mean, it only makes sense to play like this with black if you, as I understand, if you're playing d5, which leads to quite some complications, which, well, as a white player, you better know what you are doing here. Knight takes d5, I just give you the best moves here. Otherwise, black seems to be doing fine. Queen takes e4 check, bishop e3, knight d4. Yeah, again, yeah, very direct line. Now the knight is hanging on d5, knight c7 check, king e7. Quite a messy position, but unfortunately for black, white has a, well, a way to be very safe, playing rook c1, and now black's play is completely forced, has to play bishop g4, queen d3. Actually, this is the old theory. This variation was known already before computer era. People got to this position because actually the moves are pretty forced after d5, knight d5. So black has to exchange queens, play rook d8, and now the knight on c7 is in danger. Looks a bit scary, but I can assure you that you will not lose the knight on c7 if you're playing this variation. So you play f3. Another move, by the way, is h3, but let's say f3 is the simplest. Now, the most important variation is if black comes back to c8 now. Then white is much better playing f4, and after king d6, very important, knight a8. So the knight is coming back into the game, trying to go to b6 via the a8 square, quite a rare situation in chess, but this looks much better for white because two bishops and the black's king is in danger. That's why bishop h5 is a better move. And actually here white is somewhat better, but not too much. Bishop c4, maybe, for example, the safest move. Another move is f4, but I think black is quite close to equality. So bishop c4 leaves white with a small plus in the endgame, but maybe not enough if black plays accurately, not really enough to claim serious winning chances. So bishop c4. Now in case of knight f6, c3, white is better. So king d6, attacking the knight, knight d5, knight e7 now. Exchange knight, c3, let's say knight e6, king f2. Well, black will probably play at some point f6, bishop f7. Again, white has two bishops, 3 against 2 on the queen side, and of course, black still has to play accurately to make a draw here, and white still has his chances to fight for a win, but objectively, the draw is achievable here for black. But also, again, another reason to think twice about playing this variation with black, because yeah, here very forced line and no winning chances for black, again, if white knows the theory. Actually, knight takes a8 is possible. It still has to be checked with modern engines. I mean, this variation is not very popular, so yeah, not so many people checked it with modern engines. In the 90s or 80s, people were afraid to play knight takes a8, obviously, because knight takes e2 check, king d2, knight takes e3, now f e3, knight f6. Looks quite scary, white's position, but with computer maybe you can still fight for advantage. Queen b3, very direct variation, rook d8 check, king e1, b5 now is the best move. And here, well, this position needs to be analyzed. Again, let's say powerful engines are given 0-5 for white. I don't know what it means in such a position where white is rook up, yeah. Knight, for example, knight c7, knight g4, rook d1 is one of the variations which is shown by engines, and okay, 0-5, I don't know, yeah. So it's still not sure if black is equalizing here, but in any case, frankly, this variation is more, if your opponent doesn't know, first of all, it will probably not get to this position because it's difficult over the board to go to such play with white. And secondly, of course, you can definitely play this with black. Yeah? If probably you will have already a huge time advantage and your opponent will be very worried with the king on the center. So, and if you think that your opponent knows very well the theory of this variation, then I would rather think twice playing it with black. So that is acceptable for black, at least in a practical sense. But actually nowadays engines start to give bishop e2 move. I didn't know before preparing this course. Actually, I was not aware of this move. I started to check it with the engine, and by the way, the whole course, it's not just based on my old knowledge. You know, I went through every single line which I'm showing you with modern engines and just try to make sure that there are no important reassessments of some variations. And actually a couple of in few times I found that there are some very interesting new ideas which were not shown by old engines, and now there is certain reassessment, and this is one of the cases. This bishop e2 move has been found only by the very modern engines, and maybe it gives white an advantage, or at least quite dangerous move. You need to analyze it further if you're interested in this variation. And so here, after knight takes e2 check, king f1, computer pretends that white is better. Still, by the way, not dramatically, but maybe 0-6 for white again. Probably it means that it's true, white has some advantage, but still needs to be analyzed. So the main, probably the best move is queen takes g2 after bishop e2 and rook f1. Looks a bit strange, but actually might be strong. I mean, queen c6 now is the best move, if not the only move, I don't know, yeah, because the idea is that now the c2 pawn is hanging after knight takes a8. Now, actually, an interesting try is c3, completely crazy position. Again, also needs to be analyzed, maybe interesting for white, but at least bishop takes d4, queen takes c7, that is the idea, black's idea of queen c6. And now white can play bishop c3, let's say bishop e6, queen d2, and it's quite obvious that white has good compensation for the pawn here. I mean, maybe he will actually get back this pawn very soon, but I don't know if his advantage is real, and maybe black can hold this position also. So all in all, this variation is more, in my opinion, as a surprise weapon. White has quite a number of absolutely safe options, and there are a couple of principal lines, like especially queen d1, which might be, if you check it with engines very carefully, which might actually at the end of the day be a kind of refutation of the variation. So that is about the a6 move. But the main line is d6. And after d6, white has two ways to fight for the opening advantage. Well, let's start with c4, very logical, of course, just to stop black forever for playing d5. And of course, getting the center looks very nice for white, but things are not so easy again, which was discovered by Sveshnikov, who was playing quite a lot of the system in the 80s and 90s. As when he was starting with his famous Sveshnikov system, people were laughing in the 60s at Sveshnikov. Okay, how can you weaken so badly the d5 square? It cannot be good, this variation, but he understood chess very well, Sveshnikov, and was advocating this variation. Same was going with this line. Nobody believed it can be decent for black, but actually it's not so bad. This position, I mean, white probably keeps a bit of a plus, some advantage, but definitely playable with black, this variation. By the way, I myself played it a couple of times with black against Anand, if I remember well, in the early 90s, and against Peter Leko. So c4, bishop e7. Now, of course, white have tried many various ways, trying to put the bishop on d3, but again, for example, bishop d3, bishop e6, castles. But the main idea of black, now he can also make a useful waiting move, like rook c8, to wait for this knight to develop, and then after e6, knight a3. Then this main idea is to play bishop g5, to exchange these bishops, because bishop on e7 in this structure is pretty limited. And then just to develop and castle in this position is pretty okay for black. Or immediately you can also play a6, knight c3, bishop g5, but probably rook c8 is a little more accurate. So normally white is trying just to play knight c3, a very logical move, threatening knight d5, so time to play a6, knight a3. And now there is a strange but actually possible move f5. Looks a little bit too aggressive, but maybe it's not too bad also, even though still I think with quite simple play, white keeps certain plus, takes, knight c2, for instance. You can start with bishop d3, probably leads to the same position. So knight c2, knight f6, let's say knight e3, bishop e6, bishop d3. White also, I think Peter Leko, he tried at some point to play g3, but I thought also makes sense, but I thought bishop d3 was maybe more given more chances for some advantage. Castles, and this position, I remember I've analyzed it. It's not much for white, but I couldn't really find a very clear way to equalize for black, even though he has some activity. F-file is open, looks pretty fine, black's position, but after knight d4, knight d5, white wants just to play bishop e3 next. If knight takes d5, white takes with a knight, and still black has to be very, very accurate in this position to not to fall into some problems. So not so easy for black. I mean, especially important variation is that if you try to exchange this bishop, which would be great, of course, for black strategically, but then queen h5 is a problem, and after h6, queen gets to g6, and it's not good for black. So then you cannot manage this, and otherwise. Here white wants to play bishop e3 and he wants to take on d4 next, so maybe still a bit better for white. Yeah, I was not sure if black equalizes with f5. Then knight f6 is not the right concept, I believe, because you really need to exchange this black square bishop. Here I think white is just comfortably better in this position. Bishop e3, then queen d2, and yeah, f3, castles, rook d1. It's one day knight d5 comes. No, I don't think it's a good idea. Yeah, by the way, just want to mention that lately I saw that black was trying to play even with g6 this variation. At some point trying to play g6, a6, bishop g7, but I have my doubts it's good. I mean, to me, I would still go with the main line, bishop e6, with this old-fashioned way of playing. Knight c2. Well, I mean, otherwise the point is that if bishop e2, then maybe first rook c8, and then knight d4 comes. Yeah, so you need to cover the square, and actually the only reason why white is not simply much better here, because knight is on c6, yeah, and this square on d4 has to be controlled by the knight on c2, and once the knight starts to jump somewhere to d5, black immediately enters with the knight to d4. So that's why the position is not so clear, even though in general this structure is very nice for white. Yeah, there is this weak d6 pawn, potentially weak for the moment, not really, and the tasty d5 square, but as I've mentioned already, the tasty for black d4 square makes the position perfectly playable. So knight c2, now rook c8 is a very important move actually, because black wants to play bishop g5 at some point, and here he wants, white might jump, let's say after taking on g5, might jump to d5 with a knight, and black is actually defending against knight c7 check. So, and anyway, very nice c line, of course, for the rook. So now white has a choice, but let's say if knight d5, black just plays bishop g5 already with a decent position. So most logical for white is to play bishop e2 here, just to develop. And now, yeah, again, knight f6 is not great. Bishop e3, we get to the same position. Now there is a possibility to play knight a5, a very direct move, b3, b5. Actually looks interesting, but it doesn't seem to work so well, even though you need to be careful with white, you need to know what you are doing, but it seems that after knight d5, bc, actually computer gives bishop e3 here as the best move. I also thought that b4 gives white definitely some chances for advantage, but nowadays engines are happy with bishop e3. And here, well, maybe black can, I mean, strangely enough, if you take simply rook takes a6, and this position is also not easy for black. There is very annoying bishop b5 check, and quite a big initiative for white. So the best line probably is bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and as strange as it might seem, things are not easy for black, because the c6 square is quite weak. I mean, let's say knight f6, it's supposed to be the best move. b4, knight b7, yeah, now knight on b7 is quite bad. Knight a3, so white is slowly taking this pawn and starts to enter on the king side. For example, after a5, white can just take on c4, ab rook b1, and actually is taking back the pawn on b4. Still, well, he has to be accurate in this position, but it seems that at the end of the day, white keeps some advantage, some pressure here. So knight a5 is not enough to equalize, but bishop g5 is perfectly playable move. Well, the thing is that now if you take, you cannot really take on d6 because of rook d8 and d2 square. So probably the best is castle, and here it gets to this very typical position, takes, knight f6. I think here it's better to have the knight on f6 to have pressure, to have some pressure on the e4 pawn, not on e7, because then e4 pawn is not under pressure, and maybe d6 pawn might become weak. But after knight f6, yeah, I would say that this position probably white has in after a6, bishop e6, in f4 variation. The question is, and it's a little bit more comfortable for white, let's say queen d2 castle, rook d1, queen b6, so counter-attacking the pawn on b2, b3, rook d8. Yes, I actually analyzed this position for white, because it's very nice. Yeah, you get this position almost by force after c4, and black is pretty passive. Black doesn't really have at the moment any real counterplay, but I couldn't actually manage to find also for white anything special, because okay, whenever white is trying to play knight d5, black will take with a bishop, retreat with a knight, and probably have a decent game. Knight e3, immediately knight d4 comes. So how to improve white's position? A big question. So let's say maybe white can play solid moves like bishop f1, h6, very useful move, maybe h3. But what next? What next for white? It's quite difficult. I mean, nominally, objectively, theoretically, if you want white is slightly better here, it's that's true, but I couldn't really find any clear plan, and maybe black has some ideas of playing queen a7 in this position or queen c5, sometimes trying to get b5 in some situations. So all in all, playable for both sides. I mean, you are very safe with white, you can just move around, black cannot do very much, but also, yeah, not easy to understand. Definitely playable for black because, okay, you just ask your opponent what do you want, and in case white starts some play, black can also get some counterplay. So yeah, that is a c4 variation, but I think nowadays actually the main problem, I would say, of this line is knight c3. Knight c3, and of course, again, now it doesn't make sense. Black can transpose to Sveshnikov, but doesn't make sense to play it via this move order, just giving white an extra option c4 and anyway transposing to Sveshnikov in case of knight c3. So the black's original idea after knight c3 was to play a6, knight a3 and start with b5. Again, you can play knight f6. Let's say in case of bishop g5, it will be a transposition to Sveshnikov, but at least you manage to avoid some lines earlier on in Sveshnikov, so it makes some sense for black to play this move order. But again, first of all, there is fifth c4 move, and secondly, maybe here already white can seriously consider move knight c4, b5, knight e3. It might give some chances for opening plus. So then better if you already play like this, I guess you play b5 and knight d5. And here it seems to me that in the recent state of theory, it's not bad. I wouldn't say that it's totally clear, but I cannot find an equality for black. I think white has a quite comfortable game after knight d5. So what are the options? There is a strange move, knight c7. Actually, it's better than it looks, knight c7, because black wants to exchange this knight and the other one to develop to f6, pressing the center, the e4 pawn. Here, the game gets pretty direct. c4, knight takes d5. Possible to play cd5 and trying then to get maneuver the knight to c6 in the long run, but it doesn't seem to be so clear, this position. ed5 is more principled, so now black is suffering because he played b5 early, so white starts to attack the queen side, b takes c4, knight takes c4, knight f6. Okay, pawn structure is very good for black. He actually has a better pawn structure nominally, but white is rather quick creating play on the queen side. So bishop e2. Now, if bishop b7 looks logical, just attacking the pawn on d5, but suddenly after bishop d2, black is in very serious trouble here. Don't ask me why, but yeah, it's just by tempest. And after bishop takes d5, there is bishop a5, queen c8, and now rook c1, because I don't know, knight b6, there is queen c5 at least move. Yeah, but after rook c1, black's position is bad, simply bad, according to engine. So black should also probably try to develop, and here the game gets very, very direct, because if black manages to develop and attack the pawn on d5, he might be even better. But after bishop e3, covering this b6 square, I mean, trying to get with a knight to b6, rook b8, castles, castles, and a4. And it seems that white is actually just in time to create his play on this side of the board, because if bishop b7, white just play knight b6 and a5, and this knight on b6 is very annoying. White just wants to start pushing before and in a long run to organize the pass pawn on the queen side, maybe even b5 at some point. Seems that white is better here. So probably a5 is a better try, but now tactically white has bishop d2 move, rook a8, queen e1, and still the position is not totally one-sided, but it seems that it's in white's favor. quite an important variation. Of course, white has a safer ways to play. For instance, there is bishop g5 move here also possible. But that is the most principal way of playing, and probably it's good enough for some opening advantage. Therefore, black's other option is knight g7, but in my opinion, it's already better to play knight f6 than knight g7. Here there are two ways for white to play. Both are quite prosperous. In a way, it's a matter of your style. You want more control, more positional game, or you want to play in the most principled fashion. If you want to play in the most principled fashion, then c4 is a move. Again, you see the same motive. White starts immediately to attack the black's queen side. Well, starting with knight d4 doesn't change anything because you take on b5 and knight d5 is anyway necessary. So knight takes d5, e takes d5. Again, cd5 actually is also a serious try here with the idea knight d4, bishop d3, bishop e3. There is quite some theory here, but according to this theory, black is very close to equalize, but e5 is very principled. Now black has to sacrifice the pawn. Knight d4, c takes b5, and he has some play for the pawn, that's true, because of the good pawn structure, the strong knight on d4, but I'm not sure it's quite enough for equality, because, for example, bishop d7 is a very principled move, but doesn't seem to work. b8, queen a5 check. Bishop d2, queen takes d5. Looks very nice to pick up this pawn, and in general, black's position looks very central and threatening, but the pawn on a6 is an extra pawn, and actually these two double pass pawns on the even three at the moment on the queen side are also a very serious asset. And after knight c2, queen a4 check, knight e3, position is still complicated, but definitely in white's favor. So maybe black's best is just to play for compensation g6, and white is, let's say, playing bishop d3, castles, rook e1, let's say rook e8, bishop f1. Well, white, again, because of his pawn structure, he has some play and there is certain activity, but frankly, probably still it's not enough for equality. I would definitely take white here. So I'm not sure that after c4, black has a way to equalize. But in fact, if you want safer way of playing, strangely enough, bishop d3, the move which was discovered quite recently, it's also very unpleasant for black, in my opinion, maybe even simpler in a way, because, okay, black has to take on d5, he doesn't really have any play otherwise, and white wants to castle, play c4, and takes, again, there's the same problem that white is creating very, very quickly his play on the queen side. So now in case of knight d4, you just castle, g6, and now you create it in a different fashion, c3, especially using that it's with a tempi, knight f5, knight c2, and white wants to play a4, and also he wants knight b4, knight c6, so white is very quick with his assault on the queen side, and actually seriously better. So probably the best move is knight e7, and now already c4. So you see quite a difference, because knight is not on d4, where he was quite active, but in actually rather passive square e7. And black's best is again to try to sacrifice the pawn, but this is probably even better version for white, because again the knight is more passive on e7. Of course, you cannot take on d5 because of bishop e4. So I would suggest that white is also better here. So that's why the matter of choice. You want bishop d3, you want c4. I think both moves are prosperous. So then knight f6, probably the best move in the position. Again, c4 is the most principled, but now b4 is not so clear after b4. Knight c2 or knight takes f6 check. Actually quite an interesting pawn sacrifice is knight c2. Black should probably take on e4, and now just g3. Then followed by bishop g2, black probably will play f5, then sometimes white starts to break there with a3. Definitely white has enough compensation, definitely. If more than enough, I don't know. But it's a serious try for an advantage. But maybe the safest is to take on f6, queen takes f6, knight c2. And here there were games of strong players, I think including Nakamura also played it once. and queen g6, for example, knight e3. Okay, this position reminds actually Sveshnikov variation pretty much by structure. We will see some lines which are quite similar. Now taking on e4 is too dangerous, just because white develops very quickly, very powerful initiative on white square, so this is really not recommended. White is just better here. Probably bishop e7 should be played, and now bishop d3, and there is quite some theory in this position. Black will play one day bishop g5, white will play knight d5. Again, black has a very nice d4 square, white has also his trumps like knight on d5 and some weaknesses on the of this queenside pawns of black. Probably white is slightly better here. That is what also engines are claiming, but yeah, but the black's position is playable. So c4 is a serious move here, but I also like bishop d3 again. Yeah, if you want to play more positional, bishop d3 is still a very nice option. Now, of course, if you take on d5, that would transpose to this knight g7 variation, and I think white is better there. So probably black's best is just to play bishop e7, castle's castle, and now a nice move rook e1. So here white is just playing in a positional way. Rook e1, because the idea is that, let's say, if black takes on d5, we will consider then you will start to play c4 immediately. So you are waiting for the moment whether to play c4 or c3. And rook on e1 is useful anyway in this position. So let's say if black plays something like bishop e6, then c3, simply, okay, this position taken on d5 takes, I get bishop takes h7 check, king takes h7, queen takes d5 in white's favor, because he has control in the center of this d5 square. He will probably play next knight c2 and then a4. I mean, I wouldn't say it's too bad for black, but probably not totally satisfactory. I mean, white has some pressure here. Then, well, what can be played is something typical like rook b8, for example, bishop f1. White has actually, what I like about this way of playing, queen d7, knight c3, for knight c2, for white, that it's a very simple, healthy play. So you play rook e1, bishop to f1, and you start preparing a4. Let's say bishop d8, a4. Everything is very much under control for white in this position, and there's a nice, maybe not big, but a nice small positional plus. So I personally quite like it for white. So that's why maybe knight takes d5 is more principal move here. E d5, and now knight b8, trying to go to d7. And here actually you shouldn't hurry playing c4, because then before an a5 knight is going to c5 is totally unclear. So you should prepare, not let black play before after c4, and that is possible to manage in two ways. For example, bishop d2 first, with the idea knight d7, c4, and then, as you see, it's a very similar type of play. For instance, if black doesn't want to sacrifice the pawn, and I understand that maybe he doesn't want, then knight gets into a game, and it's a bit unpleasant. Knight a5, knight c6 start to be threatening. And yeah, even though again black has a good pawn structure, but white is actually quite quick with his play on the king side, at least. Maybe position is not totally clear, but engines, they like it for white and believe that white has some plus. For instance, maybe after a5, white can even play b4, maybe, I don't know, there are different moves, trying to get this. For example, just as a possible option, let's say takes, attacking the pawn on d6, and maybe a pawn will come. Of course, there is always a risk in such positions to have a problem with the d pawn, but knight can always protect from e3, bishop from f1, and again there is always this strategical idea: one day knight a5, knight c6. If knight gets to c6 in these positions, this is a very serious story. So bishop d2, but maybe here f5 actually is playable for black. c4, let's say on knight d7, c4, f5, cb, and now don't ask me why, but computer is saying as by far the best move bishop h4. And then it's a typical compensation. Black has some play, yeah, for the pawn. He wants, I guess, e4, knight e5, jumps, starts to create some counterplay. So maybe not so easy, not so clear this. Therefore, engines are pretended b4 is the most accurate move here. The same idea, c4, so you're making a useful move and stopping black from playing b4 after c4. So knight d7, c4, and in case if black takes on c4, knight takes c4, then b4 is also very useful because, let's say, if you take, probably better for black to sacrifice this pawn, because here very quickly knight will get land to on c6, and as I already mentioned, it's a very tasty square. Black will be in trouble if white manages this. But again, yeah, of course there is a lot of room still for investigation. Position is playable. I'm sure things are not too bad for black here. But I still believe that white, well, it's very prosperous for white, this position. Also this move which I mentioned, c4, is very serious. And bishop d3 is more positional way of playing. Also not so easy for black to equalize. So, and again, talking about the c4 move, the same, actually everywhere it's the same situation. White is a bit better, black is has a decent position, but he still has to prove the full equality, and probably which is not there, but so it's difficult to prove something which is not existing. So it's not fully equal, but it's not, white's advantage is not big. Yeah, and for white players, I would say that, yeah, it's a matter of taste of your choice. I think both c4, knight c3 leading to the same scenario, a bit better for white, positional play, but to have where you prefer to have the pawn on c2, on c4, that is, I gave you the overview. I believe both are quite interesting. Ways of playing c4, knight c3, both are quite prosperous for white, but I let you choose what you prefer. So all in all, a very playable system for black, but in my opinion, not completely enough to equalize.